Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I hope that you're doing exceedingly well and that you've had a fabulous day and are about to settle down for a really cosy evening with that lovely warm cup of cocoa or coffee or tea, whatever it is that you drink. You know, sometimes in our lives we have an experience that is so powerful and so poignant. It doesn't even matter when it actually occurred to us, even if it was when we were very young, we will remember every detail. And this is what happened to the lady in our story tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Celine and my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened when I was only 7 years old in 1987. But before I delve deeper into my extraordinary story, allow me to paint an amazing picture of how it all actually came about. In short, I grew up in Kentucky on a very large multi-generational 750-acre farm that is absolutely enormous. But it has passed down from one family member to another since the early 1800s. The first owner of our property, a blood relative from my father's family side, a gentleman called Mr. Earl Tucker, specified that it was his vehement desire to keep the land in our bloodline for generations to come, and our family has remained staunchly unwavering in adhering to that promise. In his will, he declared that if any family member failed to abide by this promise, that if it were at all possible, he would return from the grave to harass and heckle them until the land remained in the family line. I gather that there were family members who did actually try to sell off the land, and this man immediately took the property off the market when he swore that he had been haunted relentlessly by the ghost of Earl Tucker. The story goes that Mr. Tucker appeared to him on multiple occasions and afflicted him with great trepidation and a feeling of purgatory on a tireless basis by standing at the end of his bed, staring at him night after night, until the man could bear it no longer. To make matters worse, the man did actually declare that even during the daytime and in intimate bath time rituals, he could feel the unceasing, steely eyes of Mr. Tucker upon him, even though he could not physically see him, and it caused him to become incredibly anxious. During his lifetime, Mr. Tucker smoked a very selective brand of tobacco, and it was said that the potent aroma and stench of his tobacco lingered and wafted around the house day and night, and could be smelt in the curtains, rugs and furniture in the house, and could not be scrubbed or washed away. It only ever dissipated once the family member in question took our land off the market. I gather two potential buyers planning to buy our land and visiting the property at the time both claimed to have felt a pair of ice-cold invisible hands thump them on the back very, very hard, and they heard a distinguished male menacing voice tell them to get out. These potential buyers were utterly terrified that they literally hightailed it off our land as fast as they possibly could and never ever came back, nor did they ever again express any further interest in buying the property. My father believed that the story of Earl Tucker's ghosts was incredibly true, and so he has abided by Earl Tucker's strict rules and kept our land in our family name. We do now have 4 family homes on our property, which my father's father actually built and designed for the very purposes of renting out to local families in the area to generate more income. And over the years that has proved to work out exceedingly well for us. We do, of course, have other enterprises, like growing organic vegetables for the farmers' market and producing our own brand of organic honey from our honeybees. We also have hens producing marvellous free-range eggs and the most delicious organic milk, butter and cheese that is produced by our spectacular small dairy herd. The main house that I grew up in was naturally the most beautiful of all the houses on our land, as it stands where the original farmhouse once was, that initially was owned by Mr. Earl Tucker. My father's father was a very superstitious man and was utterly terrified of Mr. Tucker's ghost tormenting him, so he went to extraordinary lengths to restore the original farmhouse back to its original glory and pristine condition, while preserving the historic integrity of the place, accentuating the stunning wooden beam ceilings, the glorious stone fireplaces and original stunning wooden floors, and highlighting all the nooks and crannies that actually gave the original house its unique individual character and whimsical charm. The house is very spacious, airy and light, with very large French windows throughout, a grey slate angular roof and whitewashed walls. It was built on a hilly elevation and is surrounded by the undulating emerald green hills, an exquisite silvery lake that is in close proximity to the house, and is flanked on the right-hand side with a vast area of natural forest that literally stretches back for hundreds of miles, that is bursting with mature, majestic-looking pines, pecans, red maple, sugar maple, red oak and white ash trees, so typical of Kentucky that it is a haven for white-tailed deer, red foxes, cottontails, minks, muskrats, skunks, raccoons, squirrels and turkeys, and, of course, we do get the occasional black bear from time to time. Once the restoration of the original farmhouse was actually completed, my father's father swore that a beautiful white dove literally flew into the house and sat on the mantel of the original stone fireplace and proceeded to sing an enchanting bird song, and then it just flew away. My father's father unequivocally believed that Mr. Tucker was proclaiming his approval of the restorations to the property, and no one ever doubted in our family that this story was unelaborated and true. So as I told you, I grew up in this quintessential, beautiful, traditional 1800s farmhouse with my parents and my older sister Nina, who was only 2 years older than I was. One day my sister and I were playing by the lake while my mother had become fleetingly distracted by the sound of the telephone ringing, which she quickly ran to answer. I believe she thought we were playing on the swing set in the backyard, which actually wasn't the case. At that moment she was talking on the telephone to the garrulous Miss Chewing-Gum, who would literally prattle on and on forever. I gather she was one of these tiresome people that, despite the obvious verbal bombshells like, "I really think I better go now," and "there is a cake burning in the oven," Miss Chewing-Gum would never get the message, nor would she ever shift from the phone call. We called her Miss Chewing-Gum because, try as she might, my mother could never get the tiresome, babbling and chuntering woman off the telephone. My mother would describe her as so difficult that she was almost worse than trying to shift chewing gum that had got caught on a pair of clothes. So her nickname just stuck, and I never ever knew her real name. I kid you not, my mother said she was once on the phone to Miss Chewing-Gum and put the phone down for a few minutes to attend to one of our nappies when we were very, very young, with the full intention of surreptitiously returning to the call only moments later, as if nothing had actually transpired. Imagine her immense surprise and shock when a full hour later she suddenly remembered that she was supposed to still be on a phone call with Miss Chewing-Gum, and so she picked up the receiver only to hear Miss Chewing-Gum waffling and droning on, and obviously obliviously unaware that she had been talking to fresh air for an entire hour. So my mother just picked up the call and resumed the entire conversation, with Miss Chewing-Gum none the wiser for that. I loved playing around the lake as a little girl, and whenever my mother's back was turned, Nina and I would mischievously amble down to the lake, as we loved playing there, and my mother never really allowed us to be close to the water without being supervised. My sister and I were standing on the slight elevated grassy embankment that surrounded the large lake, and we were both taking turns in walking across a large piece of timber that traversed and spanned the shallow end of the lake, like a floating, bumping and doddery bridge. It was very wobbly and slippy, which made it all the more challenging and fun for us as kids. On this particular day, we both succeeded in attempting several triumphant rounds of this precarious, high-risk balancing act, seemingly oblivious to the perilous ramifications of our game, if things should go badly wrong, which invariably they did. I still remember that day with such a crystal-clear clarity, as if it was almost yesterday, because it is seared in my memory like a tattoo on a sailor's arm. There are so few memories I have of my early life as a young 7-year-old girl, but this is a moment in time that I have never, ever forgotten. I remember absolutely everything about this day with such a crystal-clear clarity, from the reflections of the trees in the water to the sight of the dragonflies buzzing across the lake. I also vividly recall the sweet, intoxicating smell of pine needles that infused the air with the scent of Christmas, to the warm, sunny shafts of sunlight that warmed my back with their brilliant sunny rays. I even recall those hazardous moments as my wobbling white tiny feet sprawled out over the tree limb that lay across the water. I could feel the rough texture of the brown bark beneath my soft feet as I pulled my weight forwards to stretch out my other leg. The log was wobbling underneath my slight weight, but I was not at all concerned about this, and I eagerly pressed forward with extreme confidence and exuberant enthusiasm as I giggled happily, while Nina clapped jubilantly. I could hear her chuckling with delight as she watched me balancing across the timber beam. But then as I put my foot down on the mossy edge of the bark that was so slippery that I suddenly began to lose my balance, I skidded and went flying and then crashing and finally sinking and plunging into the murky depths of this icy cold lake. I remember my pretty blue dress got caught up in something under the water, and I don't actually know what it was, but I was frantically trying to pull my dress away from it. And whatever it was, this structure was holding it down so hard that try as I might, my dress would just not shift, and neither could I. I was fighting tirelessly to escape this watery grave, and I fought with all my might and with every strength that I had left in me, while oscillating my arms and legs under the water like a frantic octopus. It didn't help at all that I could not swim either, which made my hopeless situation all the more deadly. I was desperately distraught and wildly trying to get air into my lungs, struggling to breathe and swallowing copious amounts of water. After a while, I just guess I surrendered to my fate, and I was filled with these incredible waves of peace, tranquility, and joy. For a moment it did feel as if I was floating in and out of my body, as bizarre and as strange and peculiar as that may sound. Suddenly the feeling became almost euphoric. I gather Nina had watched me for a moment, and then in absolute horror, realizing what had actually happened, she ran back to the house to call my mother. Quite suddenly I could feel myself being pulled away and dragged from the watery grave in which I lay, with the full force and strength of something very huge. I found myself being carried in these massive, colossal, Herculean-sized arms, and I can only imagine that I must have looked exactly like a bedraggled, very wet rag doll. I could feel something running with me in their arms, and it felt like I was running with the wind, and when they breathed they sounded exactly like a horse. I could smell the strong scent of pine needles, and I knew I was in the outer edge of the woods close to the lake. I felt a firm pressure of very strong fingers prizing out the water from my lungs, and imagine my surprise when I found myself staring up into the kindest, most concerned treacle-brown eyes that I've ever had the pleasure to see. I was coughing up copious amounts of water, and I could hear the soft chattering sound that appeared to be encouraging me to keep coughing. Then I saw her, and she wasn't human, but she was not an animal either, more like an amalgamation of actually both. She was like a human with various ape-like characteristics to her physique, like the typical overlong arms of the ape-like species. I remember she possessed these soft curling waves of hazel red-brown hair that covered her body, and even her small, firm female breasts. I do remember thinking she was like a towering giant because she was absolutely humongous in size and in girth, and she had muscle and definition which most athletes would just spend a lifetime to acquire. I cannot tell you her exact measurements, but at a guess I would say she was about 8 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 4 foot wide. I remember she had a very large cone-shaped head and huge shoulders without much of a neck, and I remember she had a long angular face, prominent brow ridge, and relatively slender mouth. Her leathery, shiny skin was like the colour of a hazelnut, but it was her deep-set, twinkling treacle-brown eyes that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. I remember them with such crystal-clear clarity all these years later. They were, to date, the kindest, most beautiful eyes I have ever had the pleasure to witness, that quite literally exuded an unconditional, non-judgmental love, second only to the love of God. That is how powerful, poignant, and beautiful her angelic energy appeared to me, without exaggeration. I remember this humanoid, hairy creature turned me around on my back and slapped me with her jumbo-sized hands as finally I spewed out some more water along with the contents of my stomach. The creature then pulled back my hair and placed her hands on my forehead and cheeks, as if ensuring that I was indeed all right, and then she darted away for a moment and came back with a huge pile of wild blackberries for me in her enormous hands, which she presented me, and indicated to me to eat by mimicking the action of eating so that I would understand what she was trying to tell me. The creature watched me very zealously as I proceeded to eat those blackberries, and the juices poured down my face, staining the edges of my mouth in a bright blue-purple colour. Even she knew that sugar is always needed after a shock. I began to enjoy the blackberries very much, and ate them hungrily, all the while observing and admiring this unusual creature. I also studied her with fascination and giggled a few times because she was so perturbed about me that her serious expression on her face made me laugh so much. She then picked me up in her arms and carried me to the sound of human voices, literally only yards away. She pushed me forwards and pointed to my mother, and then she stood there watching me from the tree line. I think she was making sure that my mother found me, but she didn't want to be seen herself, because she liked to remain invisible and in the shadows. I could hear the voice of my mother screaming, and her dress and hair were absolutely soaked to the skin, and the leather boots that she was wearing were completely ruined. She kept diving under the water, searching for me. She was sobbing, screaming, and plummeting under the water, at the same time as feeling around for me with her arms like a blind person, stumbling around the darkness in a frenzy. She kept crying, "Oh, my baby, my precious baby!" I remember walking over to the water and standing by my sister on the grassy bank, observing my mother's desperate attempts to find me. We both watched my mother diving under the water frantically, searching and screaming for me. My sister and I started to giggle and chuckle together, because seeing my mother so frantic was so funny for us at the time, especially as I was now perfectly fine. You can imagine my mother's surprise when she glanced up and saw me chuckling with my sister with a mouth stained with blackberry juice. My mother became irate. "That is not funny," she said, grabbing me in her arms and holding me for dear life, as if she never ever wanted to let go of me ever again. She was angry and yet overjoyed at the very same time, and her blue eyes were flooded over with tears. She looked at me and scolded me fiercely. "You think this is funny?" she scolded. "You think this is funny? All the while I think you're dead, you're stuffing your face with blackberries. How can you play such a horrible game on me? I thought you were dead. Do you realise how terrifying that was? You're both turning out to be monsters and mischievous, just like your father." All these years later, my mother truly believes that my sister and I pranked her that day by pretending to drown. When I tried to tell her about the hairy ape-like humanoid that had rescued me and saved my life, she told me to stop making up terrible tales and that she'd quite had enough of all our wind-ups. At the time, she blamed my father for our behaviour, because he was always making up all kinds of jokes, and she was convinced that his bad sense of humour was rubbing off on us in an insidious way. Ironically, only a week prior to my drowning accident, my father had gone to a dinner party with my mother, and he had told their hosts that he had left their gate open, knowing only too well that they owned one Rottweiler and two Bulbuls who were incredibly aggressive towards other dogs and sometimes even strangers, so it was very important for them to keep that gate closed at all times. In terror, they ran towards the gate frantically and furiously frightened, and my father hooted with laughter because they were utterly alarmed. My father found their terrified reactions hilariously funny, and my mother was not at all amused, as she thought my father had finally gone too far. So I guess it was easy to say why she thought her two children were a chip off the old block and were winding her up all the time, which was most certainly not the case. Many years after that drowning incident, my sister and I would play in the woods on a continuous basis. We would absolutely love it there, especially when it was very hot, because the shade of the trees provided us with cool relief. We also loved to watch the wildlife in the woods, and the rabbits and the squirrels were our greatest source of fascination. I do remember feeling that we were being watched, but it was never an uncomfortable feeling, and there was on no occasion ever a horrible smell. Growing up, my sister and I did swim in the lake a few times, and we would take off our T-shirts that we wore over our swimming costumes. If it was blackberry season, I would get out of the water to find my T-shirt piled high with blackberries, and I knew immediately that it was the humanoid ape that was reaching out to me saying, "I'm still out there in the woods, but I'm looking over you." My sister would always complain that only my T-shirt was filled with blackberries and that hers wasn't, and it wasn't fair, and she felt incredibly cheated. But I always shared the blackberries with her. She would wonder where they actually came from. I naturally always knew, but I never told her. When I was older and I got married to my new husband, and I moved into one of the residential homes on our land, given to us by my parents as a wedding present that naturally could not be sold because of Earl Tucker, so I was still on my childhood home turf, so to speak. When I did give birth to my first child called Martin and came back from hospital with my brand new baby in my arms, the very next morning I awoke to find a huge old cardboard box filled with blackberries, and my husband said, "Where the heck did all these berries come from?" I smiled at him knowingly and said, "Someone's wishing us well." The next time I returned home from the hospital after the birth of my second child, Thomas, the following morning there was a massive pair of antlers on our doorstep. At that time it was not the blackberry season, but my husband picked up the antlers and said, "I'll be damned. These are the most impressive antlers I've ever seen. I wonder how they ended up outside our front door." Of course I knew where they'd come from, but I never said a word. But those antlers are now proudly hanging on our living room wall all these years later. As for the ghost of Mr. Tucker, my father believes he saw him one more time after he built a barn on our land. He remembers he saw the figure of the man wearing a straw hat, white shirt with braces and long pants, walking into the newly built barn. And when he went into the barn looking for the man, he had simply vanished, but he did detect the very strong smell of tobacco. He was certain that Mr. Tucker was just checking that the barn met with his approval. All these years later, I know from the television programme and YouTube videos that the creature that rescued me from the lake was known as Bigfoot, and I choose to call her Angel because she literally saved my life. I have to say that I really loved that story, and I think it's absolutely fabulous that the Bigfoot actually saved your life, and I'm in absolutely no doubt that, Celine, your life was saved by that Bigfoot. And what a wonderful, majestic creature she really was. I can understand why you called her Angel, because she really did rescue you. And it's just unbelievable to think that things could have turned out so differently for you. I've often heard of people who get trapped under the water. They get stuck with their clothes or something like that. So that must have been incredibly frightening for you. But what a story to be able to recount. And I do love your story of Miss Chewing Gum, who I do know people like that. I know this one lady who you can never get her off the phone. She's literally on the phone for hours. So I do love the name Miss Chewing Gum. I think it's very appropriate. And as for Mr. Tucker, the ghost of Mr. Tucker, what an extraordinary story. Absolutely fascinating. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that story. I know personally I thought it was so lovely, and I certainly think the Bigfoot you encountered was an exceptional creature. I hope everyone enjoyed the story. Once again, good night and goodbye.